Okay, Dick. Well, we are at the back end of 3 o'clock. We're going to go ahead and get started here. I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Ansley Sutter, Social Media Training and Communications Coordinator with ForRent Media Solutions. I appreciate you joining us today. And we have a special guest with us. We have Nadine Green with us today to help us navigate through and understand the fair housing guidelines as they pertain and relate to social media. Nadine serves as legal counsel to ForRent, and as part of what she does is travel around the country spreading the good word, if you will, of fair housing. We're so lucky to have her today. Hope everyone, I want to invite you and welcome us to join Nadine, or welcome Nadine, and let's give her a warm welcome.
And Lee, thank you for that. And I just want to make one other point that while I do get to be senior counsel with ForRent Media Solutions, I'm never being an attorney when we're doing these education programs, whether live or on a webinar such as this. And so that for both you and me, what we are presenting today is, of course, educational advice and not legal advice, and that way we can't get sued.
That's always good to know, right?
It's good for them to know, absolutely. And I join you in welcoming everybody who chose to spend this hour with us.
All righty. Well, we appreciate that. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get started with our agenda. Before we get started, though, we are using the hashtag FRMSChat. That's hashtag FRMSChat. You see that in the bottom left hand of your screen. And we're using that hashtag on Twitter. So if you have any kind of feedback or questions, or maybe you have some insight, please feel free. We invite you to use that hashtag. And because we are inviting you to use that hashtag, one of you who is interacting with us on Twitter will receive a $20 gift card. And we'll announce that winner at the end of the session. So just sit back and relax and just hang out with us for a while. So we asked you a question when you registered for today's session, and we asked you what legal questions or concerns do you have when using social media to market or promote your community. And you provided some great feedback that Nadine and myself combed through previous to today's session so that we could create a template based off of those questions and topics that resonated most frequently. And we're so excited that we got so many questions and so much feedback from you that we almost had trouble narrowing all that content down. We wanted to cover almost everything. So there were some outliers there, and just because your question may not be answered today, that does not mean that it wasn't a great question, and we appreciate your feedback. And speaking of questions, just wanted to share a quick housekeeping tip. If any of you have any questions during today's session, feel free to ask away. I want to remind you that there are two ways you can ask questions and share your feedback. And the first way is by using the GoToWebinar questions box that you have available to you as an attendee of today's session. The second option is for you folks following along on Twitter. Use hashtag FRMSChat, and our FR Social Expert is interacting with you right now. So if you're using that hashtag, I'll jump on the webinar after the session, and what we did last year, and we'll do it again this year, is any questions that come through on any avenue, whether it be GoTo or Twitter, or even if you ask your questions via email, we'll get all those questions to Nadine, and she'll sit down and we'll hash out the answers to those and return those questions with an answer back to you. So again, if your question was not answered during today's session, rest assured that it will be answered. So if you see the screen here, these are just some basic topics that resonated most frequently, knowing kind of the basic laws of fair housing, proper verbiage to use, proper photo usage, how to safeguard yourself from negative reviews, and how that kind of dips into the legal realm, how do incentives and promotions work, and really avoiding against discrimination. So we're going to cover all of that stuff during today's session. So first, I'll share how we can use social media as a tool. And next, Nadine will cover why it's vital to adhere to the fair housing rules and regulations. Then we'll discuss some topics that resonated, again, from those questions that we posed earlier. And we always have some takeaways to share with you before you go, and we'll tweet out a few of those, and I'll share those with you via the chat option through GoTo at the end of the session. And then we'll wrap some things up with some Q&A. But I want to invite you to ask questions during the session because I can see those questions coming in real time. And if it's relatable to the topic that we're on, it would make more sense, right, to answer that question rather than to hold it at the end. So we'll kind of do a little bit of both. So by now, it goes without saying that social media is a tool that gives marketers access to endless avenues that connect a brand to its consumer. Social media allows us to do more leasing by way of Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and Pinterest and Craigslist and all those other high traffic networks that we're using today. Now, an apartment shopper can sign a 12-month lease online after they've just completed a virtual tour of your property. Imagine that. They don't even have to physically be at your property to be a resident there. And this is something that has definitely would not have been possible had it not been for social media. Social media also allows us to market. A social strategy is an amazing tool for a marketing plan, right? Think of social networks as vessels that allow you to broadcast your marketing message and promote your product or service to the world. It's almost like an online billboard. Because it's just that easy and that accessible, with that much access to your consumer, it's vital to use this marketing tool wisely. Now, speaking of using tools wisely, think about the rules of the road when you're driving, okay? A vehicle is a tool. It's a tool that we have to use, and we had to take a test to use it, correct? So if we're all reckless on the road, we'd either be injured or dead, or we will have either injured someone else, and we don't even want to think about the worst case scenario, right? You see this person who's driving on the completely wrong side of the road and is completely oblivious to it. So although, and the same goes in the way that we conduct ourselves in the online space, you can't just be reckless with your social strategy. And although the consequence may not be as harsh online as death, things can still take a pretty serious turn. So if we don't adhere to the law, there are legal implications that, at the very least, can tarnish a brand's reputation and potentially place them in some legal hot water. The best thing to do is to avoid any gray area that may potentially land you in that legal hot water. A social media policy is ideal to implement when using a tool like social media in your marketing strategy. Again, like Nadine said, this is not legal advice, but more of guidelines and best practices to ensure that you and your team are protected. And we'll be sharing a link to a social media policy that we've drafted later in the session, just so that if you are interested in creating one for your property, you can kind of use ours as a basis in which to create your own. Things to consider when you're creating a social media policy are, kind of base this document off of your corporate policies, because I'm sure there is one, and emphasize on those points that relate to social media that are inside your corporate policy, and scale it down to create a social media policy. It's also important to define the rules of engagement and suggest that they be followed to help guide your organization to respond to any type of online threats. Because by building a defined set of response procedures, you're going to minimize the amount of damage that a social media crisis can inflict. So some questions that you may want to face are, when are your employees your employees? Are you responsible for their actions when they're on the clock if they are in fact in charge of, your Twitter handle? Are you responsible for their actions on their own time? Consider your audience and be authentic. Things like this. What can they post? When and where can your employees post? So these are all things that, again, isn't legal advice, but are definitely great guidelines to adhere to.
And Ansley, I'd like to point out that these are real-world issues. I'm based here in Atlanta, where we have the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. And just last night on the 11 o'clock news, the lead story was that a gentleman who happens to be African-American had won in our Georgia lottery a $1 million prize. And someone on behalf of AJC went ahead and tweeted on their, in their realm, that now this gentleman, and named him, can go out and buy himself his own 40 acres and a whole herd of mules, which of course is a very historical reference to, slaves and what they were given upon emancipation and that sort of thing. And our entire city last night went into an uproar, and people were just, tweeting in and, all over social media, taking positions on this post. And the AJC came out, immediately with an apology and took it down, but it had been saved on screenshots. So the point is that it really is important for a company to set the guidelines for what is acceptable, what is not acceptable, and who, and all of those other issues.
That is a great example, very relevant, especially since it happened just last night.
Just last night, yes.
Wow. Wow, talk about timing. Well, that's a great example, and you can learn from big brands. Just because, you might be a small property doesn't mean that there are not relatable instances that almost show you kind of the don't side of, what not to do on social media. Look at KitchenAid. Look at what the AJC just did. There are other big brands that have gotten their hands slapped a few times that, we don't want to redo that lesson. That lesson has been learned. We've taken a takeaway from that, and we get it now. So let's remove social from the equation for a moment. And fair housing laws, were set in place long before social media became even relevant. And to safeguard yourself and your property from legal implications, the best advice would be to know the basic fair housing regulations. And what better person to enlighten us than our very own Nadine?
Well, thank you, Ansley. And, I want to play on your description of sort of the rules of the road. And you're absolutely right that the Fair Housing Act and the advertising portion of the Fair Housing Act came into place not only before social media was relevant, it was before social media was even in the mindset of anyone. And so, because this law has been around for, over 40 years. But one of the rules of the road is that you've got to be compliant in your marketing with the fair housing guidelines as relates to advertising and marketing. And I think it's real important for our industry to always understand that social media marketing, online marketing, website marketing is in fact marketing. I know we talk about it's resident retention, it's building a brand, all those different things, but the bottom line is it's advertising. And so let's be compliant with the fair housing issues. The first one you've got right up there on the screen right now, it's the Equal Housing Opportunity logo. And folks should be sure to be including that in the different platforms where they expose themselves in terms of their property, in terms of where they're going to be, in terms of the social media network. So be sure you're using the logo. It needs to be seen by people either regularly if it's a fairly static environment, or periodically if it's one of those environments where things are happening fast. But that is what tells people, both the folks that are interested in you as a rental opportunity and the folks who are interested from a fair housing standpoint about how you're handling rental opportunities. This tells them that you believe in it and you get it. So don't leave that out. And that takes us to the next piece of the fair housing issue, and that is the things that we show people in the context of social media marketing. And one of them is, of course, the issue that we show people. And showing people, even back in the days when we only had print, has always been an effective marketing tool. People like to identify. But in fair housing, we need to be sure that when we are showing people, we are having everybody shown in our particular advertising. And again, social media marketing is advertising. So the message needs to be, when someone sees anything about an apartment community, a property management company, when that information is seen and we are seeing people, the message needs to be diversity. And there's two things to be thinking about here. One is that, and I go back to Ansley's automobile and car rules of the road. I don't know anybody who has died over fair housing issues, but I will tell you that people in advertising cases have paid literally, in some of them, millions of dollars. So these kind of issues and cases, in terms of the dollar cost, are just as expensive as that horrific car accident if you're not following the literal rules of the road. And so when you're using human models, they need to represent everyone. And what folks don't sometimes understand is that the advertising itself can give rise to the lawsuit. It's the advertising itself that is the breaking of the fair housing law. It doesn't matter how wonderful the management company is, how diverse the property is. None of those things matter if the advertising doesn't depict properly the metropolitan area and the folks who are there. And quite frankly, in just about any metropolitan area you can think about today, we have white people, we have black people, we have Asian, we have Hispanic, we have amazing combinations of those people, we have people with disabilities, and we have people with children, and we need to be seeing them. So some do's and don'ts as ties to human models. Be sure that you are showing people of ethnic and cultural diversity. It's a good idea to show people with disabilities, someone who perhaps uses a wheelchair, someone who perhaps has a service animal. And unless you are advertising for legitimate senior housing, it's very smart to be showing children too. And of course, the don't is that you should not be catering to one group or stereotype or typecast. So the biggest issue that has been in the fair housing advertising arena is the white-only issue, whereas in industry we are often using only white people to show what the lifestyle pictures are, the lifestyle photos are, as relates to the community. I'm thinking that there may be another one that is sort of waiting in the wings, and that is the catering to one group, which is that young sophisticate, the one with the martini glass and the wet bar and the lap pool. And if people who have children are seeing your social media marketing and they're not getting the message that they would be welcome even though they have children, I could argue that that could be a fair housing issue there as well. So be sure that there is the diversity of people, including people with disabilities, and showing children so that that message is there in place too.
And that's some great feedback that I just thought about. Is we really only think about discrimination in terms of ethnicity, but there's this whole thing about discrimination in terms of class, right? So that's a great point that you shared, Nadine.
Yes, because people with children are a protected class under the Fair Housing Act. Every single place that we have an apartment community, people with children are protected, and the only exemption for that is, of course, that senior housing is allowed to turn away people with children because they are in age-qualified housing.
Okay. So we're going to move on to your next slide.
Yes, and this was just one to show you that how effectively and efficiently it can happen. And one of the things that I'd also like to say, and as I look here, and of course, and we see the gentleman with the service animal, we see the delightful picture of children, and then a group of people who certainly could be very happy residents together. I even see someone with somewhat grayish hair there in that group shot. So as an older person, I feel very welcome here. The point being that it's not that difficult to do. And in showing the diversity, I think it would be wonderful if we not only showed the different groups, but we did what these photos do, where we show them interacting together. Not just, you know, the white couple having their martini and the African-American couple, you know, having their cookout, and the Hispanic, you know, couple doing something else. You know, let's have them doing it together. Let's make that message. And not only is it the right thing to do from a fair housing standpoint, it's a very smart and risk management thing to do.
Great point. So we had a question come in that relates to the human models category that asks, what about companies that advertise to what may be considered a particular minority group?
All right, and the issue is this. The one minority group that can be marketed to is actually the Hispanic population. And the reason for that is that 10 years ago, in September of 2003, HUD came to the real estate industry, both apartment and the homes industry, as well as some of the media industry, and they entered into what is called a Memo of Understanding, or an MOU, and anyone who is interested can go to the HUD website, which is HUD.gov, and they can go there and they can look this up. But basically, HUD asked us, and everybody agreed in a signed document, the National Apartment Association, the Multi-Housing Council, National Multi-Housing Council, the National Association of Realtors, Hispanic Radios, that we would affirmatively market to the Hispanic population. Beyond that, target marketing to any particular racial group, international group, cultural group, religious group is problematic.
Okay, well that's great. That's great insight. We never even went that route and thought about it that way. So we appreciate that.
All right. Well, now, Ansley, you need to take the lead again now, because I've talked about what models and who they should be, but now I think you need to discuss maybe some of the issues in terms of when we are showing people, assuming we're showing the right people. What are some of those issues in terms of photo sharing?
Right, Nadine. So kind of breaking down, you broke down the do's and don'ts of photo usage from a fair housing standpoint, but the great thing about social media is that your property's social presence can be built and maintained in as little as 10 minutes a day, and that's what makes this tool so great. But going back to that wrong side driver image, you have to use this tool properly, especially when it comes to photo sharing, because now people's identities are getting involved. And these days, marketers are turning to social networks that allow us to be more visual, and you may be doing the same thing at your community, and you may be charged and encouraged to do the same thing at your community. But by taking the social management into your own hands, not only are you in control of your brand's messaging, you create a direct line to your audience. So it's vital that the images that you share across this network are presented and represent your property and your residents in an accurate but a fair light. So you're sharing the entire spectrum of the rainbow, people with disabilities, people with children. So Nadine, you touched on the issue of representing every demographic through the use of images, but another issue touches on photo sharing via the usage of a hashtag. And obviously, we're advocates of using hashtags, seeing that we use them on almost every social campaign and contest we run. But hashtags don't override the permission to use a person's photo. And it's still vital to have a photo release if you're going to share photos, especially with recognizable faces. Am I right?
Absolutely. Anybody who can be identified in a photo needs to have given permission for that photo to be used, because using it in this context is, of course, the commercial use, because I go back to what I said before. It's advertising. It's a commercial use.
Right. So we appreciate, again, and we evangelize the sharing of hashtags and come up with a custom hashtag for your property. But the next time you have an event for your residents or even for prospects, if you share a photo, you have to make sure that no one is recognizable in that photo unless they give you that permission in the form of a photo release or a model release. So a best practice is, before you post, have your residents and guests sign a model release. It's not only what we show, so in the form of photos on social media, but it's more so about what we say, right? So words are just as impactful as visuals. So Nadine, I know you have some insight on the usage of words.
Absolutely, I do. But before we leave the model release form, I just want everybody to know that this is a snapshot of, it's not the actual form. This is not
Correct.
Good enough, so I don't want anybody thinking that they should take this particular slide and make that the permission. It's just sort of a general example. And so in terms of, do not be showing folks, residents, their guests, your employees, don't use them in your advertising, which social media marketing is your advertising, without their permission to do it. It is a commercial use. But you're right, Ansley. We talked about what we show, but of course in fair housing, and when we are talking, and when you've got that hashtag that's going along with something that you're saying, then of course you have the issue with words. And I'd like to point out, it's my mantra. I like in my professional life that it can be said it's a mantra. My husband says I nag. But this isn't, but when you say it in work, it's actually a mantra. But it basically is that if it wasn't legal in print in terms of fair housing back before, when it was in fact, basically print and billboards and that sort of thing were our media, that if it wasn't okay before, it's not okay now. Social media, as wonderful and as amazing and as absolutely valuable for apartment communities and property management companies that it is today, it is still not so special that the rules don't count. The rule, it doesn't matter what kind of car you're driving, a VW Bug or a, or a Lexus or a top-end BMW, you still got to follow the rules of the road. The vehicle doesn't change the rules that you have to follow. And so what I've put together is a quick list. And of course, Ansley, people are going to have access to our slides after they've been our guest on this particular webinar, correct?
They will. We will send you a follow-up email with a link to the recording, and this link will be hosted on our YouTube channel, as well as you'll have access to the PowerPoint deck via our SlideShare link. So all of that will be sent to you via email in the next few days.
All right, because that absolutely makes it where I don't have to spend a lot of time reading a slide. And so up here on this particular slide that everybody is seeing right now, you're going to be seeing a list of words. There's only 6 there. It doesn't mean they're the only 6 words that you shouldn't use, but these are the ones that seem to come up in the language of the apartment world, and ones that in certain contexts, if you're not careful, either by themselves or in context with something else, can get you in trouble. And so I've put those that are sort of my personal red flag ones that I often like to share. And then on that same slide, of course, on the other side, we have the safe words, because I hear people saying, well, we can't say that or we can't say that. And I want people to know that those safe words or those expressions are not just that Nadine Green is saying that they're okay. Those are taken from the advertising memo that HUD put out years ago that's still in place. And by the way, that's available at HUD.gov as well. And so they say that those things are okay to say. So I'd also like to say now that if anybody has, because Ansley is watching your questions as they come in, if there's a word that you are wondering about, like is this one okay or is that one okay, and you want to type a quick question, and then the next couple of minutes Ansley will, mention that and we can, backtrack to this. But in absence of those questions, I just want to spend another couple of moments on the fair housing issue and tell you that I know a lot of you are doing wonderful events now at your companies, your host companies, at your properties. You're hosting really neat events. And so we're going to make a transition now and talk just for a moment about event hosting.
Okay, so we did have a few questions come in as far as, yeah, so if you want
they're cold. They're quick. I think we're tracking okay that we can probably take a couple of them, and anybody who we don't take their good question, we will, of course, be giving answers in the, outreach that you do after this program. So what were a couple of those questions, Ansley?
Okay, so we have someone asking, why is it incorrect to say, quote, senior independent living community, end quote?
And I could do an entire seminar on that, and actually in January I am. It is because that nobody has to be independent in order to live in housing. What we have done is there are landlords out there who provide housing for seniors, and that's all they provide. They don't provide any kind of assistance. They don't provide any meals. They don't provide any kind of help, and that's fine. Landlord doesn't have to do that. But the people that live there don't have to be independent as long as they themselves or through their own arrangements arrange for their meals or their care or their assistance. And so the fair housing people are very unhappy with the industry term independent and active, because they say that they believe that that discourages people from going into or even considering housing that should be open to them.
Okay. Well, just piggybacking on that question, that term, independent and active, seem to have gotten a lot of people asking questions, which is great. We want you to get the correct answer. So thank you for that question, Anna. Also, Donna and Leslie kind of asked the same questions as to what words can be used in place of active or independent.
I'm thinking that you should not use active at all. Okay, and in terms of independent, because it has really become, even in the housing industry outside of the apartment industry, it has become sort of a term of art. I think it's very important that somewhere in the visible world that you define independent as this housing provider does not provide anything other than housing, or perhaps you might actually, provide meals. It may be, beyond housing and, food and board, room and board kind of thing. We do provide meals. I think it's important to be sure that you're saying things that, number one, are very affirming to people who may have disabilities, and in that case, I think to balance out the use of the word independent is that I would be sure that the people that I show would have very visible disabilities so that people would understand that the traditional idea of some able-bodied person is not what you're looking for.
Okay. Well, that is great feedback. And we actually had a question that related to photo releases. So I can either hold that to the end, or we can ask that question now. What do you think?
Oh, let's go do it now, and then we'll just pick up the pace a little bit. How's that?
Okay. So we had a question that asked, and this is a really interesting question from Steve, asking, can you add the photo release as an addendum to the lease to cover all photos that may be taken?
Arguably, you could, yes. But, because then it would become part of the contract, but it would have to be very well crafted to make, not just that we can take your photos and use them. It would need to be, very well crafted that, a commercial use, and we'll use it, in a variety of places, blah, blah, blah. And here's the other thing. What will you do when someone who is signing a lease gets to that and says, but I don't want to agree to this? I don't like the way I look. I don't want my pictures posted. I've been abused by my previous spouse, and I don't want him to know where I live, relocated. I'm in the witness protection plan, not that you would be saying that. Custody issues where, for the children and things like that. So can you put it in the lease, and would it be okay if it's well-crafted language? And I think it's one of those conditions that needs those little initials on the side. Everybody who does lease work knows that there's certain conditions in their lease where you draw extra attention to it. But you need to be prepared. You need to be prepared from a process and procedure standpoint. What are you going to do when someone says, but I don't agree to this? Are you going to say, well, fine, you can't live here? Which you could do, but is that, smart from a return on investment trying to get, occupancy? And if you do allow them to cross it out, are you going to monitor that well so they don't accidentally get in those photos that you may put on your social media outlet?
Okay, well, that's great feedback. So again, like you said, you have the option to do so, but you have to consider the consequences if you do an all-or-nothing type of lease.
Right, absolutely, and be prepared for the what-ifs. Always when you create any policy, do the okay, but what if?
Right.
And say, what are the different scenarios that someone would present? What if? Okay. And so tied to the whole fair housing thing, because we see these kind of events happening, which can be a fair housing issue as well, but we also don't want folks posting events that create the wrong vision in terms of fair housing. So I've given some examples on the next slide of event ideas. And to be fair, some of them are very clever and they're not really mine. I just approved them because they are okay. But I just love some of them, like Yappy Hour for the pet owners, Food Truck Friday, Around the World Potluck, even Kids Club, because, of course, people who don't have children aren't protected, so you can do things and market to people with children. What you need to watch out for is anything that excludes someone based on their fair housing protection. We generally would tend to see that either with events where children can't go, which could be a problem, and also the gender-based issues, such as a ladies' night out or a man cave Mondays. So anytime you have an event, just make sure that it doesn't exclude anybody based on race, color, religion, sex, national origin, where they come from, who they are, that they have children, that they have disabilities, or any of the other protections that might be in place where your property is located. And so with that, let's just continue on. And I think, Ansel, you've got some neat ideas of just showing some of those photos for some of those neat events.
I do, and a few of the people who joined us last month did see this photo, but I have a question regarding this photo. So as it relates to the whole kind of photo release thing that we just talked about.
Yes, you need 873 model releases, and I know that because I counted the people. No, actually, for a photo like this, no one is identifiable from a commercial standpoint. You may know that you were standing and you were wearing a bright hot pink top and you were getting food from the yellow truck, and now you look and you think, oh, that's me. Oh, look at me. The little tiny you with your little yellow, truck with the hot pink top, you and your hot pink top. But that's not enough to make you identifiable, even if you could know where you stood and find yourself in here. So for this particular shot, if this was at a community or the community had gone in with some other companies and had put this on and they wanted to post this, absolutely okay with me without any model releases.
So what about this photo? That being said, like you said, all photos are pretty much fair game if no one's recognizable.
Yep.
Okay. So this is just something that we can take away from Nadine's feedback, where it's fair game if they're not recognizable. If they are, best practice is to get a photo release. Now, this might be a tricky one. What about if someone is, an apartment community is hosting a yappy hour? What about if their dog's recognizable?
And I'm thinking it's probably okay, because I don't know that unless it's Lassie or Rin Tin Tin, and there's so many young people who probably don't even know who Lassie and Rin Tin Tin are, but, I don't think, because it's the use of the image and it's the right to yourself, I don't know the fact that, your dog or your cat, your canary or whatever would end up in the post, that in and of itself should be an issue. So I don't think that's the one that we need to lose sleep over.
Okay, great. Alrighty, so moving on from the whole photo release usage and sharing those photos on the social space, handling reviews is always a hot button topic in multifamily, just because this industry is so reliant on the use of positive reviews and boosting your brand advocacy. But the truth of the matter is we don't always get the 3-star or higher reviews, and oftentimes we don't know how to handle the 2-star or lower negative reviews, so we tend to ignore them. And not addressing negative reviews not only threatens your brand credibility, it often steers an apartment shopper into the arms of your competing property, who is actually going to respond to those negative reviews, believe it or not, that have been left about their property. So it's not so much about getting positive reviews as it is responding to reviews of every sentiment. And the question is, how do we handle negative reviews, when does a negative review need to be handled in-house versus in the court system? So I know that there are some response best practices that will help you determine if this needs to be handled in-house versus the court system. So before you take it to the court, 9 times out of 10, you can handle a negative review with your own task force in-house. There are just a few guidelines that need to be met. So take a moment, step away from that review, remove any initial anger that you may have, try to remove all emotion if you can. Always try to relate, even if it's difficult. Use empathy. And in some cases, the customer may not always be right, but that doesn't mean you can blame them. You can't play the blame game. And try to take your conversation offline by offering a phone number or email address and respond in a time-sensitive manner. With these 5 simple rules, you may save a lot of time and money by handling it in-house. These are some real-world scenarios. So, for example, a maintenance person or a resident that made a review regarding to maintenance. Every time an appliance needs repair, it takes forever and a day, let's not exaggerate here, to get anything fixed when I put in a request. In the middle of July, it took me 2 weeks to get my AC repaired. I mean, who wants to be sitting in a hot, stagnant apartment in the middle of July with the AC broken? I don't think anyone does. But this is the property's response. First of all, they took accountability. Hello. On behalf of so-and-so property, we want to apologize for the inconvenience and discomfort our delay may have caused you. So number one, they're taking accountability and they're implementing some empathy here. Next, propose a solution so that this does not happen to you again or anyone else living in our community. So indirectly, they're covering all their bases, both prospects and residents. We will make sure there are enough maintenance professionals on site to address those needs. So again, scale your response according to the bandwidth that you have with your maintenance team. And as we always say, if you need help crafting a response, rely on our FR Social team to help you. We're more than happy to help you craft a response. But the last thing you need to do is not respond at all and then take it to the court. Because Nadine, I know that you mentioned before, it may not even be worth it to take it to the court.
Absolutely, absolutely, and we can talk about that in a minute. But who should actually respond to these kind of things, do you think, Ansley?
So it kind of depends. You have to really read that review and take a step back. And there are pros and cons of either, your corporate umbrella of your property management company responding to that review, or the local level, the local property manager. So a pro is with corporate, obviously they're not going to be as emotionally tied to the issue because it didn't happen to them. It happened to them indirectly, but they are coming down the pipeline and being brought into the loop as opposed to having it happen directly. But a challenge is that there could be a delay in response time, and the last thing you want to do is have this heated review go without being responded to. With the property manager, a pro is obviously they're going to be tied into a little bit more of the details, backstory. They may even know the person who is leaving the review. Even if it's anonymous, they may just be that intuitive enough to know who left that review. But a challenge is, again, those emotions may get involved and it could just snowball. So I would, 9 times out of 10, I honestly would suggest that the property manager or the most local person closest to the person who's left the review respond. That way you are more likely to take that conversation offline, number one, and you can implement those 5 rules that we just went over. That way you can respond without emotion, and you are not only winning back that disgruntled resident, but you're winning new prospects by seeing that you're actually responding to these reviews.
And what might work, actually, Ansley, before we move forward, is maybe a hybrid of those two things. You talk about the con is, of course, that there's so much, that the corporate folks would have to get brought up to speed and and get it written and everything. Maybe the idea should be that the on-site person, the person that's closest to it, that has the information, should craft it and then run it by corporate, so they can just look at what is encapsulated within that response, and not have to go into so much crafting and everything. That's always easier to edit than create. So maybe it needs to be where the on-site people do the real writing and just simply then get corporate to bless off on that, because I think sometimes otherwise you may have within your organization that tug of war. But sometimes it's not just an opinion. Sometimes they say something that's not just negative. It's actually unlawful to be saying it. Libel is when somebody makes a statement. In this case, it's written. And by the way, in case anybody cares, slander is when we speak it, when I say it, and libel is when I write it. So, of course, online it's going to be written. But it's published. It could cause the community injury, and it ain't true. It's not just an opinion, oh, it's crummy, service is bad, they don't know what they're doing, that kind of thing. And so when that happens, there may be actually a legal course of action. Somebody can be sued for trying to do you damage and harm by saying untrue things about you. That being said, even though you may have a legal case, you would go to your attorney and they would say, oh yeah, you've been libeled, we need to do something about this for you. Just because you can sue might not mean that you should sue. And I mean that purely from a reputation standpoint. While you may be very upset about this, very angry, feel very injured, the bottom line is maybe not that many people have seen it, but by golly, a lot of people are going to hear about it when you file that lawsuit. Because whoever wrote the bad thing about you, even if it was legally bad, and now you start a lawsuit against them, they're very likely to go into the world of social media and do the, can you believe this apartment community? Can you believe this property management company? I go on 3 months ago and said this about them, and now they're suing me, and it's going to make more people look at you and not necessarily in a favorable light. So just because you can doesn't mean you should. And while you may have legal rights, just before you exercise them, look at them from a business standpoint. And of course, sometimes people say good things about you, or you want them to say good things about you, and those, of course, are endorsements. And what you need to know, and we've got some really now, slides with not any of Ansley's pretty pictures, just all the boring language. But basically, there are laws about, of course there are rules of the road, so there's laws about endorsements, and not what Nadine says, but what the Federal Trade Commission says, the FTC, is that the person who is saying things about you have to be their own real experience. Okay? It can't be just representative, and I like to always use those like little diet, things where somebody says, I lost 432 pounds on this diet. Well, you know what? The rest of you aren't going to lose 432 pounds. And so it has to be what other people logically would have. Like you could lose a lot of weight on this would be appropriate, but not the 432 pounds. And you need to be sure that you have permission when somebody says something good about you, that you have to have their permission to then turn around and use that in any kind of testimonial endorsement. So if somebody writes you a thank you note because your leasing agent was so wonderful and helpful, and they say nice things, before you publish that, you need to have permission to do that. For the last, coming up on 4 years, the FTC has said that anybody who says anything good about you, if they're getting anything for it, and that includes if you have a blogger or somebody that you have asked to post on your behalf, they have to tell the public that they're getting something for you, something from you in order to review and say good things. Or if they're your employee, they have to say, I'm an employee. So if I wanted to go into my own personal social media place and say that I think ForRent Media Solutions is the best marketing company in the world, I would have to tell people that I work here. And so if you give anybody anything, if you say to a resident who's maybe very active on social media, we would love it if you would blog on our behalf, and we'll buy you pizza, or we'll take $10 off your rent, or we'll give you a little extra something here or there. They absolutely, if they are blogging on your behalf and they are in fact saying nice things about you and getting something from you, you have to tell the public. And that's not Nadine's rules. That is the Federal Trade Commission's rules. And so just be sure that you remember that. And I've summarized that on the next slide, that that's an endorsement, and you must disclose, and they have to go ahead and tell the world that they are getting something or that they are an employee. And so I'm looking at our clock, Ansley, and we probably need to start letting them know what are some of the things that they can do and some of the takeaways. And then if we do have any other questions, we can address them and still let everybody go away at the top of the hour.
Okay, great. Well, like I always do every month, I give you some things that you can implement to today. So things you can do today are more so ask yourself, what message am I sending? And is my message fair housing compliant? These questions will help you safeguard and mitigate yourself from social media risk. Another great tip to take home, start thinking about creating a photo release form. And like Nadine said, it can't just be that simple screenshot you saw. You can even Google different photo releases. And Nadine, what would you say? Would you suggest that they create a photo release form from scratch, or probably take it to corporate and see if corporate has something that they can use at their property?
I mean, in a perfect world, whoever does some of the legal work for the property or the property management company ought to be doing this. But quite frankly, there's some very good ones online. They're not that complicated. They just need to be thorough.
Right, right. Another thing is ensure that your photos and events are making feel anyone and everyone included, okay? So these, like Nadine said, we can't have a ladies only night, can't have a man cave Mondays, although I'm sure you'd like to. You can still have events that focus around a spa party or even a tailgating party, but you're not telling people what gender is allowed and what gender is not. Last thing is not to ignore negative reviews. Again, keep it in-house, take it offline, and more times out of any, you'll be able to handle it on your own before making a big fuss in a public stink by taking it to court. So with that being said, I'm going to share some valuable links with you. You can either write these down right now if you're taking notes. I'm going to chat these with you if you are on the webinar today using GoTo. So I've just sent those to you guys who are using the GoTo platform as opposed to Twitter. If you're on Twitter, you can either jot these down, but you'll also get these in your follow-up email. So rest assured you're going to get these either way. So we have a few minutes before we announce the winner for some Q&A. So I'm going to kind of skim through these questions. And this was a good one, and you and I talked about this, Nadine, the other day, where you're giving incentives from a B2C standpoint versus a B2B standpoint. So we had Lexi ask a question asking, what if we announce that we are giving something away? For instance, on Facebook, we say, quote, the first 10 people to leave us a review will earn a $10 gift card, end quote. What should Lexi be doing in that situation?
Well, the first thing, of course, is to always be sure that whatever the current rules are for Twitter, Facebook, their own rules in terms of Twitter or Facebook, that you're doing whatever today is okay in the eyes of Twitter or Facebook. But in terms of this, if somebody is in fact going to be saying something about you or even liking you on Facebook, and you're going to be giving them something, then again, that's an endorsement, and they need to say, I'm doing this because I want to be one of the top 10 or the first 10 that does this because I want something. I'm doing this to get something, so therefore there is that compensation of that endorsement.
Okay. Another question we have from Brian. This is an interesting question. What about not allowing kids at an event where alcohol is being served?
I think that that is problematic. I always say when I'm talking in my fair housing classes that anytime you are leaving children out, put in a different group. Would you say that, we're not going to allow American Indians into this particular event because of the high, alcohol, there's a high percentage of alcoholism on an average basis within that population. Are we not going to let a particular group come in here? And people have the right, who are grown-ups. It's not about the child's right to be at that event. It's about the grown-up who signed the lease to participate as fully as anybody else with the occupants of their lease. And so I think that you can have rules as to who will have access to the alcohol, who's allowed to drink the alcohol, but I don't think you can have a party that says that people cannot bring their children when they are full-paying lease holders, and those are occupants.
Okay, that's interesting. So we have some other questions coming in, but we're getting tied up with the time, so we are going to answer any other, and we keep sending your questions in. We want that to happen. We're just going to get with Nadine on the back end and send those questions to you directly. So we have your emails. Don't worry about it. We'll send it straight to you, and your question will get answered. So I just want to invite you to come to any of our sessions that we have for the month of November. I've just shared the calendar. We have a few more events for the end of this month, but we'll have a new social media training calendar. And before we announce the winner and wrap up the session, ForRent has a lineup of products that will help you connect with today's winner. And today's winner has the option to start their apartment search a variety of ways. And some renters will discover you online on your ad and will immediately seek your community video. Others will want to consult difference in the opinions of their friends and family in the World Wide Web after reading your print ad. And of course, many will come across your ad on their mobile phone, on their smartphone, while toggling between sites like Facebook, all in front of the TV, like we talked about second screening last month. And we have some great offerings because we understand, ForRent Media Solutions understands the generation of renters and the story of how they search. So if you're interested in any avenues such as FR Web, FR Video, FR Print, FR Mobile, FR Social, and FR Targeted, we will help you out. Be sure to get in touch with your ForRent rep and they can get you set up with that. So let's go ahead and end today on a high note and announce today's winner. We appreciate everyone's participation on Twitter, and today's winner is GSI Management. Congratulations, GFI Management. Make sure that you DM us your mailing info, and we will pop that gift card in the mail to you. Congratulations, GFI Management. So again, I appreciate all of you joining us. Nadine, it was a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us and taking time out of your busy schedule.
I had fun, and I appreciate it and am honored that you asked me to participate with you in your program today, Ansley. Thanks.
Great. Well, with that being said, we appreciate your participation, everyone else, and we encourage you to follow it and keep in touch with us on our social networks, Facebook, Twitter, and Pinterest at Apartments for Rent, APTS for Rent. You'll find us there. So with that being said, I'm going to end our session today, and everyone have a great day, and we will make sure we get your questions answered. Have a great day, everyone, and take care.
Bye-bye.